Playing doctor again, O'Brien? They didn't know. The entire hospital staff, the residents, the attending physicians with their framed diplomas and their six-figure salaries, none of them knew what they were looking at when she moved through the hallway. She had held a dying man's heart in her hands in Baghdad, performing a field thoracotomy under fire with nothing but a scalpel and muscle memory keeping him breathing long enough for the helicopter to arrive. But here at St. Michael's in Raleigh, she was invisible. Just another RN in navy scrubs, pushing medication carts and answering call lights. The hospital hierarchy had a way of flattening people. It wasn't a request. It was a structure. Doctors at the top. Nurses somewhere below. And Megan O'Brien somewhere below that, the quiet one who didn't speak unless spoken to, who corrected errors in whispers, who had learned 847 days ago that staying silent kept you alive. They didn't know. Not yet. And that was exactly how she needed it. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical dirge as she clocked in at 6:36 a.m. The cardiac floor of St. Michael's stretched out in front of her with its usual controlled rhythm, monitors beeping in synchronized patterns, for pumps hissing their incremental ticks, the smell of antiseptic lead thick over stale coffee. Cold stainless steel gleamed under the harsh white light. She pushed her badge through the reader and felt the familiar click of the turnstile, the small acknowledgement that she belonged here. Or at least that she was permitted to be here. The distinction mattered more than most people understood. O'Brien. Patricia from the night shift was already halfway through report, her voice carrying that particular exhaustion of someone who had been awake for 13 hours. The nursing station smelled like old coffee and the faint chemical ghost of hand sanitizer. Megan nodded, pulling up her patient assignment on the computer. For rooms on the cardiac floor. 2 post-MI, 1 arrhythmia, 1 awaiting discharge. Nothing acute. Nothing that would draw attention. Room for 12, the Admiral still stable but irritable, Patricia continued, flipping through her handwritten notes. Wants everything yesterday. Room for 14 is the usual, chest pain that's not cardiac, but the doctor insists on another round of troponin. Room for 18 is new admission, admitted at 4:22 a.m. with atrial fibrillation. Haven't started the diltiazem yet. And for 20 is heading home this afternoon. Megan took the report without writing anything down. Her memory for details had always been useful. In Baghdad it had kept people alive. Here it just made her seem odd. Thanks, Megan said quietly. Patricia gathered her things, already retreating into the days of someone about to try to sleep in daylight. The night shift nurses were already fading, their faces bearing the particular exhaustion of people who worked against the body's natural rhythm. Megan moved through the hallway with practiced efficiency, checking vitals, reviewing charts, making notes in the computer system. She was good at this work. Better than good. But goodness here was currency that didn't spend. Credentials were currency. Titles were currency. Experience that could be explained and documented on a resume was currency. Everything else was just noise. She worked the first hour without incident, checking the Admiral's cardiac monitoring strips, normal sinus rhythm, clean, nothing concerning. Room for 14 was the predictable false alarm. Room for 18 needed close monitoring but the medications hadn't been ordered yet. By 7:38 a.m., she had already caught 3 medication errors from the night shift, corrected a mislabeled blood draw, and noticed that room 414's patient was actually presenting with classic GERD symptoms and not cardiac chest pain at all. She said nothing about any of it. Speaking up was a choice she had learned not to make. At 7:51 a.m., Megan went to her locker in the break room. The metal door swung open to reveal the sparse interior, a change of scrubs, a small water bottle, a granola bar she kept forgetting to eat, and tucked behind everything, in the very back corner where it wouldn't be visible, the folded flag. She reached for it without thinking. 3 years it had been in this locker. 3 years of her hand finding the same fabric, the same careful folds. The flag was the color of dried blood and ash, the creases worn soft from handling. Her fingers traced the triangle shape, the careful geometry of grief. The flag represented something most people would never understand, something that didn't exist in any official record anymore. It represented 8 years of service. 2 tours. A clearance level that had been redacted from every document. And it represented Jackson, who had been beside her in the Jolin district when everything went dark, who had been there when the order came through to extract the wounded Marines, and who had not made it to the helicopter. She held the flag for exactly 9 seconds. Then she placed it carefully back in the locker, adjusting it so the corner caught the light just so. This was her ritual. This was how she stayed connected to the person she had been, while ensuring no one at St. Michael's would ever discover she had been anyone at all. O'Brien. The voice came from behind her. Megan turned. Dr. Mercer stood in the doorway of the break room, his stethoscope draped around his neck like a sash, his white coat pristine and pressed. He was the kind of man who looked at a room and calculated his position in the hierarchy, measuring everyone against the invisible scale he carried in his head. He had been on the cardiac floor for 14 months. Megan had learned to move around him the way prey animals learn to move around predators, carefully, predictably, with no sudden movements. "Good morning, Dr. Mercer," she said, closing her locker and turning to face him fully. "I need you to check the medication orders for 414 before they're pulled," he said, his tone carrying the particular impatience of someone who believed his time was more valuable than physics allowed. "The resident wrote something that looks wrong." This was a test. Megan understood the architecture of it immediately. He was watching to see if she would catch the error. And then he would use that moment, the moment she had corrected his resident's work, against her somehow. She had seen this pattern before. She had seen it everywhere she had worked since coming to St. Michael's. "I've already reviewed them," Megan said, keeping her voice level. "The diltiazem dose is 0.25 milligrams per kilogram. Your resident calculated 180 milligrams, patient weighs 76 kilograms. Should be 19 milligrams to start." Dr. Mercer's face shifted. Not anger exactly. Something closer to the look a man gets when his wallet has been lighter than he expected. He opened his mouth, closed it, then turned without responding and walked back toward the patient rooms. Megan had just committed a tactical error. She had made him look small in front of his own decision-making process. And he was the kind of man who would make her pay for that small mercy. She returned to her patients. The morning moved with its usual rhythm. By 8:13 a.m., she had drawn blood for the troponin panel, checked the new admissions for site, and reviewed the discharge paperwork for room for 20. By 9:06 a.m., the grand rounds began. Grand rounds were the hospital's theater of power. 20 residents and medical students would follow Dr. Mercer and the attending physicians through the patient rooms, learning case studies and diagnostic strategies. They were also where reputations were made and unmade. Megan knew this. She had seen it happen before. The residents would gather around the beds while the attendings discussed the cases, and somewhere in that discussion, there would be an opportunity to highlight excellence or to highlight failure. The teaching was incidental. The hierarchy was the point. Dr. Mercer's voice carried down the hallway as they approached the cardiac floor. She could hear him from room for 12, hear the particular cadence of authority in his tone, the voice of a man explaining the world to people he believed were fortunate to be listening. Megan adjusted the Admiral's monitor leads and made a note about his blood pressure. She was careful to look busy but not frantic. Visible but not memorable. They arrived at room for 14 at 9:22 a.m. The GERD patient was sitting up in bed, looking considerably less distressed than he had been at shift change. Dr. Mercer walked through the door followed by his small army of residents, his white coat moving like water around his body. This patient presented with chest pain at 2:02 a.m. Dr. Mercer began, addressing the group with the particular confidence of someone who had already decided how the story would end. Initial EKG was unremarkable. Troponin series ordered. However, the floor nurse has been suggesting to the residents all morning that this is a psychiatric case rather than a cardiac one. Megan felt the attention of the room shift toward her. She did not look up from the medication cart. "The nursing staff has suggested protocol violations," Dr. Mercer continued, his voice taking on the texture of disappointment. "They've been advising against the proper workup for this patient." When the resident appropriately ordered a second troponin measurement, the nurse questioned whether we should even be treating this patient. This is what happens when nursing staff begin to think they understand medicine better than the physicians who have trained for 8 years. He was constructing the narrative. Megan could see the architecture of it even from across the room. He was not interested in the truth. He was interested in establishing dominance. In showing the residents that challenges to his authority, even the quiet, unspoken kind, would be punished with public humiliation. The proper protocol in a case of potential acute coronary syndrome is to rule out pathology through lab work and imaging, Dr. Mercer said. Not to allow personal opinions to interfere with patient safety. 20 residents took notes. 20 minds absorbed the lesson. Nurses were obstacles to proper medicine. This particular nurse was someone who prioritized personal opinion over evidence-based care. And Dr. Mercer was someone who would protect the integrity of medicine against such intrusions. Megan pulled another medication from the cart. Her hands were steady. Her face was a clean, empty slate. But inside, something had shifted. This was not the first time. It would not be the last. But it was a marker. A moment when she understood exactly what she was dealing with. A man who needed to be larger than everyone around him. A man who would use whatever tools came to hand to maintain that position. The group moved on to room 412, the Admiral's room. Megan remained in the hallway, checking the vitals monitor remotely. The Admiral was stable. Sinus rhythm maintained. No acute issues. She had just turned away when she heard Dr. Mercer's voice again, this time from inside the Admiral's room. The nursing care here has been adequate, but the staff tends to make assumptions rather than follow protocols, he was saying. This is a common problem in cardiac nursing. Intelligence is not a substitute for proper training. Megan's hand paused on the medication cart. She had learned long ago not to react to verbal strikes. Reaction meant engagement. Engagement meant escalation. She had learned this in Iraq, where showing anger to an enemy gave them exactly what they wanted. She learned it again here, where showing anything at all gave Dr. Mercer exactly what he wanted. She continued her work. By noon, the rooms were stabilized and the morning crisis had not materialized. By 1:15 p.m., the results came back from the lab. The good patient's troponin was negative. His EKG remained normal. No evidence of myocardial infarction. No evidence of cardiac pathology. The diagnosis Dr. Mercer had been building the narrative around had never existed. The Admiral was still resting comfortably. Room 418 was responding well to medication. Everything was proceeding according to the normal rhythm of the hospital day. At 1:02 p.m., Megan took her break in the break room. She was alone. She stood at the vending machine, feeding a dollar bill into the slot and pressing the button for black coffee. The machine hummed and dispensed the cup. She was reaching for it when she heard the door open behind her. O'Brien. Dr. Mercer stood in the doorway. His posture was casual but his eyes were sharp. He was holding a file, one of the patient charts. "I wanted to discuss your approach to patient safety," he said, his voice carrying that particular texture of false concern. "Because what happened in room 414 this morning cannot happen again." Megan turned to face him fully, the coffee cup still in her hand. "You questioned my clinical judgment," he continued. "In front of a resident. You suggested that a patient with chest pain did not require cardiac workup. Do you understand that if this patient had had a silent MI, that choice could have killed him?" Megan looked at him. She did not blink. She did not speak. This was her composure style, controlled anger that never broke the surface, that manifested as absolute stillness. "The next time you feel the urge to practice medicine without a license," Dr. Mercer said, his voice dropping into a register that was just loud enough to be heard in the hallway outside, "I will have security escort you off this floor. And if you ever question my clinical judgment again, I will ensure that question becomes very expensive for you to ask." "Understood." Megan took a long, deliberate sip of her coffee. Then she set the cup down on the table beside her. When she spoke, her voice was quiet and level, each word precise as a surgical instrument. The difference between us, Dr. Mercer, is that I have actually held a dying man's heart in my hands. She did not explain what she meant. She did not elaborate. She simply turned back to her coffee, leaving him standing in the doorway with the sentence hanging in the air between them like a blade. Dr. Mercer's face darkened. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then seemed to think better of it. He turned and walked back out into the hallway, his jaw working silently. Megan heard his footsteps receding toward the patient rooms. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't even the beginning. At 6:14 p.m., Megan clocked out for the day. The evening shift was already settling into their stations. The monitors hummed their electronic songs. The hospital moved forward with its relentless rhythm, the endless rotation of patients and problems and small ethical compromises that added up to something vast over time. She walked through the parking lot to her 2008 Honda Civic, the one with 143,000 miles on the odometer. She drove through Raleigh's evening traffic, watching the traffic lights change colors, watching the city settle into its nighttime routine. She drove to the small house she rented on Maple Street, 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a yard that needed weeding and a porch that needed repairs she couldn't afford. Inside, the house smelled like the particular blend of childhood and routine, crayons and yesterday's dinner and the faint ghost of her daughter's strawberry shampoo. Sophie was sitting at the kitchen table, her homework spread out in front of her in the careful, anxious arrangement of an 8-year-old who wanted desperately to do everything correctly. "Hey, bud," Megan said, setting her work bag down by the door. "Hi, Mommy," Sophie said, looking up from her math worksheet. "You're home early." "It's only 6:30. Megan felt something shift inside her chest. The shift was small but significant. It was the shift that happened every time she had to stand in front of her daughter and present a version of herself that was safe, that was normal, that was just a mother coming home from her nursing shift. Long night scheduled. They had too many people, Megan said, moving past the moment without really entering it. "Let's get dinner started." She moved through the evening the way she always did, making pasta, supervising homework, reading a bedtime story to a child who was becoming too old for bedtime stories but still wanted the ritual. By 9:13 p.m., Sophie was asleep. By 9:17 p.m., Megan was sitting alone in the kitchen with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands, her thoughts moving through the architecture of Dr. Mercer's humiliation the way a surgeon's thoughts move through the anatomy of a body, cataloguing each moment, each word, each strategic choice. She should have said nothing. Should have let the comment in grand rounds pass without response. Should have accepted the verbal strike the way she had accepted so many others. But she hadn't. And now there was a man who felt diminished, who felt challenged, who felt the particular sting of having his authority questioned. And that man had access to the hospital's administrative structure. He had credentials and diplomas and a social network built over years of playing the game correctly. Megan had none of those things. She had only her silence and her competence and a folded flag hidden in a locker, representing a version of herself that the world had decided should no longer exist. She picked up her phone and looked at the time, 9:28 p.m. In Baghdad, it would already be Thursday morning. On a base she could no longer visit, in a military structure she was no longer part of, people who knew her real name would be moving through their day. But those people were no longer supposed to acknowledge that she existed. The Pentagon had ordered that erasure with particular precision. Captain Megan O'Brien had become just Megan O'Brien, RN. And if she ever tried to be anything else, everything would come apart. She sat in the dark kitchen and waited for the things that were coming, though she could not have named them yet. The vending machine's fluorescent glow cast shadows across the empty break room at 11:38 p.m. Megan stood before it, the mechanical were filling the silence, watching her reflection distort in the scratched plastic. The folded flag pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. She reached for black coffee, the third one since 7 p.m., when Dr. Mercer's voice cut through the hum. "Playing doctor again, I see." She didn't turn. Her fingers hovered on the button. "You know what your problem is?" His tone carried the particular cruelty of a man who'd never been told no. You think correcting me in front of trainees makes you clever? Makes you one of us? You're not. He moved closer, his cologne sharp as antiseptic. You'll always be a nurse playing at competence. Reaching for things that aren't yours. Megan withdrew her coffee. Steam rose between them. I've been watching you. His voice dropped, voice like a tank idling in a garage, all weight and barely contained power. The way you move. The way you assume you know better. It's pathetic, frankly. A 5-minute review of dosage calculations and now you think you understand medicine. He laughed, a sound designed to diminish. You understand nothing. You will never understand. You lack the credentials. The education. The authority. He paused, letting each word land. And frankly, the intellect. She turned to face him then. Her eyes met his with a kind of cold that had no warmth to steal. The break room seemed to contract around them, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like insects in amber. If security has to escort you out of here, Dr. Mercer continued, it won't be the first time someone's questioned your right to be anywhere near a patient. One call to administration. One complaint about scope of practice. One suggestion that you're practicing medicine without a license, and your career ends. Do you understand me? The silence stretched 5 seconds. 7. Megan took a sip of her coffee, black, bitter, still steaming. When she finally spoke, her voice emerged low and even, each word cut from something harder than bone. The difference between us, doctor, is that I've actually held a dying man's heart in my hands. And I didn't need an audience to do it. She turned and walked past him. The break room door hissed shut behind her. Dr. Mercer stood alone before the vending machine, his reflection staring back at him like an accusation he couldn't quite comprehend, the echo of her words settling into the spaces where his certainty used to live. The next humiliation came during grand rounds the following afternoon. 23 residents circled the teaching bed like sharks, their white coats creating a barrier between themselves and what they were meant to become. Dr. Mercer had positioned Megan at the end of the circle, deliberately in sight, deliberately within earshot, as he reviewed a case file, his voice pitched for pedagogical authority but sharpened for something crueler. This is what happens when protocols are ignored, he announced, gesturing vaguely toward her. When nursing staff decide they understand clinical judgment better than trained physicians. I've documented 17 instances this year alone of scope creep. Dangerous scope creep. He looked directly at her. Some people, he said, confuse protocol violation with heroism. They're not the same thing. One gets people killed. A resident, young, ambitious, hungry for approval, laughed nervously. Another joined in. The sound spread through the circle like infection. Megan kept her expression exactly as it was, neutral, absent, the way you look at a wall. Dr. Mercer's eyes narrowed slightly. The laughter died. He'd expected her to flush, to flinch, to give him something he could point to as validation of his authority. Instead she stood motionless, and the weight of her stillness made the silence heavier than any words could have. The third time came that evening during the shift change. Megan was updating a chart at the nurse's station when Dr. Mercer approached, deliberately loud enough for the adjacent staff to hear. I'm recommending we restrict your access to the cardiac floor pending a competency review. His words fell like stones. If security needs to keep you out of certain patient rooms, I want full documentation. I'm not comfortable with your level of unsupervised practice. It's negligent. He paused, studying her face as if searching for a crack. You're a liability now. Everyone knows it. 3 nurses at the station suddenly became very focused on their screens. One, Jessica, who'd brought Megan coffee every morning for 2 years, turned her chair away completely. The sound of keyboards clicking filled the void where support should have been. Megan didn't respond. She closed her chart. She clipped her badge to her scrubs with the same precision she used for everything else. Then she looked directly at Dr. Mercer, and something in her eyes made even him step back, not fear exactly, but the recognition that he'd been staring at something far deeper than his own reflection. 30 minutes later, during evening rounds, a Navy corpsman appeared on the cardiac floor, tattooed forearms visible beneath his rolled sleeves, escorting Admiral Hutchinson, 71 years old, silver-haired, moving with the particular dignity of a man who'd commanded thousands. The Admiral had requested a transfer to St. Michael's for cardiac observation, his cardiologist citing a recent arrhythmia that required monitoring. The corpsman was young, maybe 28, built like someone who'd been through selection courses that broke ordinary men. He watched the nursing staff. He watched Dr. Mercer conduct initial rounds. Then a routine code alert, another cardiac patient, not the Admiral, pulled Megan from the medication station. She moved with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before, her hands steady as she prepared equipment, her movements economical and purposeful. The code lasted for minutes. She worked the crash cart while a resident fumbled with the defibrillator pads, her voice clipped and precise, charge at 360. Clear. The patient's rhythm converted. Sinus rhythm established. Breathing resumed. The corpsman stood in the doorway watching her the entire time, his expression shifting from professional observation to something else, something that looked like recognition, though that was impossible. Impossible because she was just a nurse. Just someone in scrubs with tired eyes and careful hands. But when the code ended and Megan turned, their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. The corpsman's jaw clenched. He looked away first, his hand moving to the challenge coin hanging beneath his uniform, an unconscious gesture, muscle memory older than words. She saw it. A coin bearing an insignia she could identify from across the room. Task Force designation. 160th Special Operations Unit patch. He knew something. She had no idea what, but he knew. He said nothing. He returned to the Admiral's room and stood at attention like a man guarding the door to a classified facility. Megan finished her charting, her hand steady though something had shifted in her chest, that old sensation, the one she'd learned to recognize in Baghdad at 3 a.m. when the radio crackled with call signs that weren't quite right. Danger wearing a familiar face. Admiral Hutchinson was settled into his bed by 8:22 p.m., cardiac monitor displaying the steady reassuring beep of normal sinus rhythm, his corpsman positioned outside his room with the kind of vigilance that suggested this wasn't just a simple cardiac observation. This was something classified. Something protected. And somewhere in the hospital, in the break room, in the medication station, in the space between one shift and the next, Dr. Mercer was reaching for his phone, his mind already cycling through the network he'd spent years building, board members who owed him favors, references he controlled, investigators who asked the right questions if you knew which palms to grease. He was done testing her compliance. He was done waiting for her to crack. Tomorrow would bring the calls that would unravel everything she'd built here, the careful life she'd constructed in Raleigh, the normalcy she'd been promised when they gave her a new social security number and told her that captain didn't exist anymore. But he didn't know what she'd really done. Not yet. And the corpsman standing guard outside Admiral Hutchinson's room, the one whose challenge coin caught the hallway light at 8:38 p.m., he was already making calls of his own. The cardiac monitor on the 4th floor started singing its flatline song at 3:06 a.m. Not a warning beep. Not a rhythm irregularity. A long, continuous wail that meant someone's heart had decided to stop cooperating with the concept of staying alive. Megan was 2 floors below, restocking the supply cart in the ICU, when the overhead speaker crackled. Code blue, cardiac floor. Code blue, cardiac floor. The words fell into the hospital like stones into still water, and everyone around her froze for exactly half a second before the machinery of emergency medicine kicked into gear. She didn't run. Running was panic. Running was amateur. She moved with the terrible fluid precision of someone who had spent 8 years knowing that hesitation killed people faster than bullets ever could. Her badge caught the hallway light as she passed the nurse's station, 3:07 a.m. now, and her shoes made no sound on the tile because she had learned long ago that stealth was another form of preparation. The elevator would take 45 seconds. The stairs took 22. When she pushed through the cardiac floor doors, the code was already unraveling. Dr. Patterson stood near the patient bed with his stethoscope hanging useless around his neck, barking orders that nobody seemed confident enough to execute. A resident was doing chest compressions, but his rhythm was wrong, too slow, breaking ribs for nothing. The monitor still showed the long, flat line of a heart that had abandoned its purpose. Room for 12. Admiral Hutchinson. The Navy corpsman standing at the room's edge saw her first. His eyes went sharp, tactical, the way eyes went when they recognized something deadly approaching in a controlled manner. His hand came up, not aggressive but grounding, the muscle memory of someone who had worked in trauma before the hospital ever hired him. She met his gaze for a single fraction of a second and saw him calculating. Saw him remembering something. Saw his lips form a word he didn't speak aloud. Megan entered the room and her voice dropped an octave. "Stop compressions. We need to maintain," Patterson started. "Stop. Now." Not a request. It was a command, and it came from somewhere deeper than a nursing certification. It came from a place where rank mattered more than titles, where authority was measured in decisions that had consequences you could count in body bags. The resident's hands stopped moving. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's mechanical breathing, each inhale and exhale like a metronome counting down something irreversible. She moved to the bedside and assessed in milliseconds. Admiral Hutchinson's chest had no rise. His neck veins were distended like they were trying to escape his body. His oxygen saturation was 58 and falling, the monitor numbers dropping like a countdown to something final. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung pushing everything else aside, crushing the heart from the inside. The kind of thing that killed people in minutes if you were thinking like a civilian. The kind of thing that took seconds to fix if you remembered how. Pain was information. Pain was data. And this room was screaming. 14-gauge needle, Megan said. Someone, the resident, probably confused and following the voice that had suddenly replaced the attending's authority, pressed it into her hand. The corpsman was already reaching for the prep tray, his movements anticipatory, his face a study in recognition he was forcing himself not to show. She saw his hand shake slightly. Not fear. Not anymore. That was something else. The needle went in at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the precise anatomical intersection where the system allowed you to bleed off pressure the way you'd release steam from a valve. She felt the resistance of skin, the give of muscle, then the sudden hiss of air escaping. That sound. That exact sound meant something was working again. The monitor changed. The flat line fractured. A rhythm emerged from the nothing like a city appearing through fog. The Admiral's oxygen saturation climbed, 58, no weight, 62, 68, pushing upward, 75, 81, 86, stable. His chest expanded. His neck veins went slack. The invisible weight pressing down on his heart lifted like someone had removed their boot from his sternum. Beautiful, Patterson whispered, and Megan realized he was watching her hands, not the monitor. Watching the way her fingers moved with the confidence of someone who had done this not in simulation labs but on a concrete floor in a place where the sand stayed red and the rules of triage protocol were written in blood and decision-making under fire. The corpsman's eyes met hers again. He stepped closer under the pretense of helping, and when he leaned in to attach the post-procedure monitoring equipment, he whispered something that was barely sound. Fallujah, 2014. She didn't answer. Didn't look at him. Just continued her work, her movements now falling back into the patterns of a nurse because the captain had done her job and was retreating back into the shadow work again. But her hands were trembling, and the trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was 7 years of muscle memory colliding with 7 years of erasure and winning. "Get the chest tube kit ready," she said aloud. "We need to manage the air leak before it's not just his heart we're managing." The orders came naturally. Not hostile, just efficient. The room responded because they could hear something in her voice that had nothing to do with a nursing license and everything to do with someone who had learned to lead in places where leadership was the difference between leaving in a helicopter or a body bag. Patterson stood aside. The resident moved. The corpsman helped her position the Admiral for the next procedure, and his hands were steady again, and his eyes kept sliding toward the surgical scar visible on her left forearm where her sleeve had ridden up during the needle decompression. The kind of scar that didn't match the narrative of a hospital nurse. The kind of scar that asked questions in a language only certain people could read. The Admiral's eyes fluttered open. His breathing stabilized around the tube. His color returned from that particular shade of dying gray to something approximating human. Patterson nodded at her, not permission exactly, more like acknowledgement, and she stepped back to let the postcode protocols take over. The vital signs were climbing. The rhythm was holding. The patient was coming back. As Megan turned to leave, the corpsman followed her into the hallway. She kept walking, her pace unhurried, her face empty of expression, because she had learned that answering questions only created more questions, and more questions was exactly what got you erased. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said quietly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a military challenge coin, the kind with insignias that didn't appear in any official registry, that were given to people who had been places and done things that the government would never officially acknowledge. The kind of coin that was a password without being a word. "Then you won't mind if I report that Admiral Hutchinson experienced a successful needle decompression for acute tension pneumothorax at 3:13 a.m. under the care of Nurse O'Brien, whose clinical judgment and manual dexterity exceeded standard protocol in optimal ways." He let the coin catch the hallway light. "Just making sure the paperwork is accurate." She met his eyes. Held them. Understood exactly what he was doing and why. The corpsman wasn't trying to expose her. He was creating a paper trail that would help explain certain things if anyone ever decided to ask. He was back up. He was someone who remembered. He was someone whose presence in this hospital suddenly made much more sense. The intercom crackled. Another code. Another patient. Another reason to move forward and not look back. "Thank you," she said. It wasn't much. But it was the only honest thing she could afford. She walked back toward the stairwell, and by the time she reached the 3rd floor, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. 7 digits. A military exchange. A code name she hadn't heard in 7 years, Nightingale 7. "We see you. Sit tight." What happened next would change everything. The Admiral's eyes had closed at 11:13 p.m. By midnight, Dr. Mercer was already dialing. The first call went to Richard Bancroft, a board member who owed him a favor, a messy situation involving a malpractice settlement that Mercer had quietly helped bury 3 years ago. The phone rang twice before Bancroft answered, his voice thick with sleep. "It's Mercer. We have a problem at the hospital. A nurse. Megan O'Brien. She's practicing beyond her scope. Way beyond. I need this documented before it becomes a liability issue." Silence on the other end. "Then, what kind of beyond scope?" "She performed emergency procedures tonight. Needle decompression. That's physician territory. She's been doing this for months, probably. I want it on record that I reported it immediately." The second call came at 12:06 a.m. This time, to a clinic administrator in Durham who managed a Veterans Affairs facility where Megan's employment records supposedly lived. The voice on the other end was confused at first. No one called at midnight about hiring verifications, but Mercer's tone carried the weight of authority, of concern, of someone protecting the system from fraud. "I'm verifying employment and credentials for a Megan O'Brien who claims specialized trauma training. Can you confirm she completed your Advanced Combat Casualty Care certification?" A pause. Papers shuffling in the background. "We have no record of that. No record of her at all, actually." "Thank you. That's what I needed to know." The third call took longer to connect. The State Medical Board's after-hours emergency line. Mercer had practiced this speech in the mirror of his car before dialing. "This is Dr. James Mercer, St. Michael's Medical Center. I'm reporting a nurse, Megan O'Brien, for practicing medicine without a license. She performed invasive procedures tonight that are clearly outside nursing scope. I have witnesses. This needs immediate investigation. By 1:13 a.m., 3 separate systems had begun their mechanical grinding. A board member's email. A clinic's notation. A state investigator's open file. Mercer smiled at the steering wheel. She'd made a mistake. Showing off. Drawing attention. All he'd needed was one mistake. The next morning, Megan arrived for her shift at 6:16 a.m. like always. The locker room was emptier than usual. A nurse named Patricia, someone she'd worked beside for 14 months, suddenly became very interested in her phone when Megan walked past. By 7:22 a.m., her badge was deactivated. Administrative leave, pending review, the HR director said, not making eye contact. Effective immediately. We'll be in touch. The words came at her like they were happening to someone else. Practicing beyond scope. State board investigation. Patient safety concern. Protocol violation. Each word was a door closing, and she couldn't stop any of them from slamming shut. I understand, Megan said. Her voice came from somewhere deep, somewhere that had learned how to sound calm when the world was collapsing. I'll cooperate fully with any review. The director cleared his throat. Security will escort you to collect your personal items. Then you'll need to leave the premises. 2 hours later, she stood at her locker while a security guard waited 6 feet away. Her hands moved methodically through her belongings. Stethoscope. Notepad. A photo of her daughter at age 4, now 8 years old. The coffee mug someone had given her in year 1. And at the bottom, under her spare scrubs, the folded flag in its plastic ceremonial case. She'd carried it here for 3 years. Touched it before every shift. Held it like an anchor to someone she'd loved and lost. She pulled it out. Held it. The plastic was worn now, marked with fingerprints and dust. She could fold it again, tuck it somewhere else. But her hands just held it, still. You about done? The security guard asked. Not unkindly. Just procedural. She turned. Behind him, through the locker room window, she could see 3 nurses at their lockers. They'd all turned away. All suddenly very focused on their own things. Patricia didn't even look up. Megan packed the flag carefully into her bag. Done, she said. The drive home took 18 minutes. She knew because she watched the clock. 18 minutes to dissolve from Captain Megan O'Brien, combat medic, trauma surgeon, woman who'd held dying men's hearts in her hands, back into Megan, the quiet nurse from Raleigh who didn't exist before 3 years ago and was now ceasing to exist in real time. Her apartment was silent when she opened the door. Afternoon light cut through the kitchen windows in geometric strips. She sat at the table, still in her scrubs, still smelling like hospital antiseptic and fear. The folded flag came out of her bag and she set it on the table in front of her. The Pentagon had promised her a life. A new name on a new Social Security card. A daughter who would grow up without classified operations hanging over her head. A normal job where she could help people and nobody would ask questions. 8 years, they'd said. 8 years and they'd reassess. 8 years of erasing Captain Megan O'Brien so thoroughly that even the nurse standing in scrubs at St. Michael's wouldn't fully believe she'd ever existed at all. She'd made it 7 years, 11 months, and 23 days. Her vision blurred. Not from crying, soldiers don't cry, the old voice said, but from a kind of exhaustion that went deeper than sleep could touch. She put her hand on the flag. The plastic was cool. Inside it, the stars and stripes that had draped a flag-folded coffin 6,000 miles away. That flag had been the only thing they'd let her keep. The only proof that Private First Class Marcus Webb had been real, had mattered, had died in her arms because an operation that never happened had gone sideways in a place that officially didn't exist. The front door opened. Mom. Her daughter. 8 years old. Home early from school. The school she wasn't supposed to have to pick up from today because Megan was supposed to be working. Emma's backpack hung off one shoulder, her face confused, her eyes moving from Megan's face to the flag on the table and back again. "Mommy, why are you home early?" The question hung in the kitchen air like a physical thing. Megan couldn't answer it. Not without lies. Not without truth she'd been ordered to take to her grave. Not without explaining that her entire life was a classified fiction, that everything her daughter thought she knew about her mother was a cover story maintained by federal directive, that there were people in locked offices who had her real personnel file and she wasn't allowed to acknowledge any of it. She couldn't tell Emma that sometimes the people you help don't help you back. That competence without credentials means nothing to people with the power to make you disappear twice, once officially, and once personally. That she'd saved a man's life 8 hours ago and that same life was now being used to destroy her because she'd shown her hand, revealed something underneath, proven that the quiet nurse was something more. She couldn't say any of it. The word caught. She swallowed. My shift got rearranged. It was a lie. Emma would learn to recognize her mother's lies now. This was how it started. How the distance began. How the wall between them would build itself, brick by brick, secret by secret, until her daughter grew up and realized that the woman who'd raised her was someone else entirely, someone who couldn't even tell her the truth about why she was home at 2:38 p.m. on a Wednesday, crying at the kitchen table. Emma set down her backpack slowly. "Are you sick?" "No, baby. I'm okay." Another lie. Emma sat down across from her and stared at the flag. Her small hands were on the table. She didn't ask what it was. Maybe she already knew. Maybe she could sense the weight of it the way animals sense storms coming. "I'm going to make you tea," Emma said finally, and she stood up and pulled the stool over to the counter to reach the cabinet where Megan kept the cups. Megan watched her daughter move through the kitchen with the careful precision of a child who'd learned her mother sometimes needed the world to be very quiet and very small. She didn't cry. Her eyes burned, but soldiers don't cry. Instead, she sat at the table with the folded flag in front of her and watched her 8-year-old try to make tea with hands that barely reached the electric kettle. And somewhere above the city, above Raleigh, above St. Michael's, above the kitchen where a woman and her daughter were learning how to speak across an ocean of classified information, a sound began. Distant at first. Then growing closer. The distinctive thump-thump-thump of helicopter rotors, moving fast through the afternoon sky toward the hospital district. The sound grew louder. The helicopter rotors grew louder, shaking the windows of the administrative conference room on the 5th floor where Dr. Mercer sat smugly in the gallery, his tailored charcoal suit perfectly pressed, his expression that of a man who had already won. The hospital board was reviewing Megan's case, her alleged scope violations, her fabricated credential gaps, the formal complaints he had meticulously filed. He had orchestrated this moment. 3 phone calls. 3 favors called in. 1 nurse erased. The board chairman shuffled papers. "In light of these findings, we're recommending a formal investigation before reinstatement can." The intercom crackled. Code Blue. Trauma Bay 2. Staffing crisis. All trauma surgeons in active cases. Then the doors burst open. EMTs wheeled in a stretcher with a man bleeding through 4 separate pressure dressings, a gunshot wound to the lower abdomen, barely conscious. Afghan accent. The intake nurse read aloud, a GSW victim, asylum seeker, former military, age 34, BP 82 over 51, O2 sat 69% and dropping. The man's skin had taken on that grey-white pallor that meant minutes, not hours. The board meeting dissolved. Doctors began moving toward Trauma 2. Then the trauma chief turned. "We need O'Brien. She's the only one not tied up. Somebody find her." Dr. Mercer's jaw tightened. Megan was in the administrative office downstairs finishing paperwork on her termination when security found her. They didn't say much. Just, "They need you. Now." Her hands moved before her mind caught up. Scrubs still fit. Badge still worked, the same badge they deactivated yesterday. Muscle memory. Her body remembered what her life was supposed to be. She pushed through the Trauma 2 doors and the room shifted. The patient's head turned toward her and his eyes, his dark, desperate eyes, went wide with something that looked like impossible recognition. He strained against the restraints, mouth opening, and the words came out in accented English that dropped like a stone into still water. Angel of Fallujah. The room froze. 7 years. 7 years since that call sign had been spoken aloud. Since the blackout night in Jolan district when she'd pulled 12 Marines from a collapsing compound while rounds tore through the wall beside her. Since her entire service record had been scrubbed from existence by men in windowless rooms who told her Captain Megan O'Brien no longer existed. She didn't flinch. Her hands moved to the patient's abdomen. 2 large bore 4s. Type O negative, push it. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath. The commands came out flat, surgical, without hesitation. The nurses moved. This was her space now. A Marine Corps liaison was stationed 2 floors up, security detail for Admiral Hutchinson, and he heard those 3 words over the hospital radio as it echoed through the corridors. Angel of Fallujah. His hand moved to his secure phone. By the time Megan had the patient on the operating table prepping for a field thoracotomy, the liaison had pulled her classified file from a Pentagon database that didn't officially exist. He was standing in the doorway of Trauma 2, reading aloud as if speaking scripture. Captain Megan O'Brien. Navy Nurse Corps. Silver Star for extracting 12 wounded Marines under direct fire. Fallujah, 2017. Dr. Mercer pushed through the crowd. That's enough. She's under investigation for stolen Valor and scope creep. She has no credentials to. Bronze Star with Valor for emergency thoracotomy performed without anesthesia on a Marine with a sucking chest wound. The surgical light caught the scar on Megan's left forearm as she worked, thin, precise, 20 years old, matching the citation perfectly. That's not her file. Those credentials are false. Mercer's voice had lost its composure, become something desperate and shrill. She's a fraud. I can prove. The liaison kept reading. 2 Purple Hearts. Promotion to captain recommended but deployment prevented due to medical evacuation. Then the doors opened again and a 2-star general walked in, gold shoulder boards catching the fluorescent light. General Patricia Hewitt, in-theater commander for the Northern Operations Group that year. She saw the scar. She saw Megan's hands moving with the precision of someone who had practiced this procedure in conditions where mistakes meant death. She saw the patient's eyes still locked on Megan's face like she was the only real thing in the room. General Hewitt stepped forward and saluted. Her hand came up, fingers to temple, held sharp and perfect. Straight to a nurse in blooded scrubs performing emergency surgery. The room went dead silent. Megan didn't return it. She was elbow-deep in a thoracotomy, her voice steady as she called out vitals. I need fresh gloves. And someone tell me what his core temp is. Dr. Mercer was stammering something incoherent when a phone on the general's hip rang. She answered. Listened. Her expression hardened into something that looked like federal authority. This is General Hewitt. Put me on speaker. Her voice cut through the room like a blade through tissue. I have a Pentagon liaison with me. I'm transferring you to the surgical team now. The speaker crackled to life. A man's voice, someone important, someone used to being obeyed, spoke with the careful diction of official communications. This is Deputy Director James Walsh, Department of Defense Personnel Security Division. Codename Nightingale 7 is hereby declassified, effective immediately, due to circumstances beyond containment. Captain Megan O'Brien's service record is now to be treated as classified material. No further investigation will proceed. This is a direct order. The line went dead. Dr. Mercer's face drained of color like someone had opened a valve. He looked at the general. At the Marine liaison. At Megan, whose hands were still moving, still saving lives, still exactly where she belonged. His mouth opened. Closed. He backed toward the door. but 23 minutes earlier, someone in the crowd outside Trauma 2 had filmed Dr. Mercer's vending machine tirade from last week, the part where he'd cornered Megan, where he'd threatened her with security, where he'd mocked her for playing doctor while his voice dripped with something that sounded like fear. The video was already uploading to 3 different social media platforms. By the time Mercer reached his office, it had 70,000 views. The caption read, "Dr. Bully Secret War Hero." His medical school mentor, Dr. Sarah Hartman, retired Navy surgeon, 72 years old with 3 silver stars of her own, saw that video at 4:41 p.m. while sitting in her living room in Chapel Hill. She watched it twice. Then she called the St. Michael's board chairman directly. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of someone who had stood in operating tents under enemy fire. "I trained that man for his oath. He has disgraced it. He has disgraced the uniform. He has disgraced the patients he swore to serve. If your institution does not take immediate action, I will ensure the medical licensing board knows your name alongside his." The board chairman called an emergency session. 2 hours later, the patient in Trauma 2, the one who had spoken that forbidden call sign, was stable. Blood pressure 103/61. O2 sat 94%. Core temperature rising from the bear hugger warming blanket. He would live. Megan had pulled him from the edge, just as she'd pulled a dozen Marines from a compound 7 years ago that the government still wouldn't acknowledge had ever existed. Admiral Hutchinson was awake now, 1 floor above, his heart stable in the recovery room. Megan found him there sometime after midnight, after the paperwork, after the interviews with people whose badges said things like NCIS and Department of Defense. She just needed to see him. To know that first save had held. The Admiral was watching the window. He turned his head when she entered, and even weakened by surgery, even diminished by age and trauma, his eyes held the clarity of command. His hand came up slowly, and he saluted her from his bed. Not to the nurse. Not to the junior officer. To Captain Megan O'Brien, to Angel of Fallujah, to the woman who had refused to let him die. She stepped to the window. The folded flag, that scrap of fabric she'd carried for 7 years, pressed against her locker like a secret too heavy to keep, she finally took it out. Her hands trembled for the first time all day as she unfolded it. The blue field caught the morning light. She placed it on the windowsill where the dawn could reach it, where the sun could finally find what she had hidden in darkness. The Admiral was watching her. His voice came out hoarse, barely more than a whisper, "Welcome back, Captain." But that wasn't the end of it. Not even close. 2 days later, the FBI walked in with NCIS agents flanking them, their badges catching the light like daggers. Dr. Mercer was still at the hospital, still showing up for rounds like nothing had happened, like a viral video with 92,000 shares didn't exist, like the board chairman hadn't personally called him to inform him that his termination was effective immediately. He was in the physician's lounge when they found him. Agents Donnelly and Park, NCIS, moved toward him with the precision of people who had done this before. "Dr. Robert Mercer, we have some questions regarding your filing of false reports with the State Medical Board, your fabrication of credentials, and your obstruction of a federal investigation involving classified military personnel." He tried to deny it. His voice came out in pieces, fractured and high-pitched. He had been defending hospital protocols. He had been protecting patient safety. He had only called the board because he had legitimate concerns. His face was the color of old paper, his hands shaking so badly he dropped his phone. They cuffed him right there. Silver cuffs clicking with finality against his wrists, cold metal against skin that had never known consequence. They read him his rights while 3 nurses watched from the break room doorway, their expressions perfectly blank. He had made them look away for months. Now they looked at him with something that transcended emotion. It was simple, final erasure. The hospital board announced reforms that evening. A new policy on scope of practice that emphasized expertise over credentials. A partnership with the VA to expand specialized trauma training for nurses. And a position, Director of Trauma Operations, salary $127,000, authority over all trauma protocols, offered to Captain Megan O'Brien by General Hewitt herself, standing in the hospital administrator's office. Megan listened to the offer. The general was watching her face, waiting for the refusal or the acceptance. "Thank you, General. But I'll stay as a nurse. The floor is where I work best. Your service record shows. My service is where people need me to be. That's been true in Baghdad. That's true here." She paused. "I need to make the rounds." The next morning, she was back in scrubs, checking vitals on the post-op floor, reviewing labs with residents who now knew her rank but addressed her as Nurse O'Brien anyway because she had taught them that titles meant nothing against competence. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the specific restraint of someone who had been ordered to disappear and had chosen to reappear on her own terms, in a space that had nothing to do with glory and everything to do with staying beside the people who needed her. In the cafeteria, 3 weeks later, a barista at the coffee station wrote a number on the cup. Not a love declaration. Just digits. A possibility. Megan almost smiled when she saw it, but professionalism held. She had learned long ago that some connections couldn't be rushed. Some people needed to know who you were before they decided if they wanted to stand beside you. 6 months later, Dr. Mercer was spotted driving a medical supply van across rural North Carolina counties. The name tag on his uniform read Steve. The van was faded blue with a dent in the side, and he flinched, an involuntary contraction of muscles, every time a customer called him doctor. Some of them did, out of reflex or kindness. He never got used to it. He delivered supplies to clinics and nursing homes, and nobody asked him about his credentials or his reputation. They just needed the products. The work was clean and simple and utterly without status. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Scars tell stories. They tell you where someone has been, what they've survived, what they've learned. Megan's scar told a story in Arabic and English, in blood and training and the kind of choices you make when the world stops watching. It told the story of a nurse who had held a dying man's heart in her hands and didn't need an audience to do it. The flag on the windowsill told the story too, that some sacrifices are witnessed only by those who make them, and that's enough. If someone you trusted tried to bury you, would you choose to disappear? Or would you stand and let the truth break into the light? Drop a comment. What would you have done? If you love a good underdog story, hit that like button now. Subscribe so you never miss one. And comment below, have you ever been the underdog? Let's see how this plays out.